Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Romeo and Juliet. This video is going to focus in on Act 4, Scene 5, the short scene where Juliet's family find her body. So let's get started. So as always, let's start with a quick plot summary. The scene begins with the nurse arriving at Juliet's bedroom, ready to wake her up for what she thinks is going to be her marriage day. But of course, she finds her in a state that she assumes is dead. It's quite positive in these first moments when she's trying to wake her up. But then, of course, she soon realizes that something dreadful has happened. And so she calls for Juliet's family. Lady Capulet arrives first and has a very, very big, very, very emotional reaction. So does Lord Capulet when he appears. Soon after that, the Friar Lawrence and Paris also show up, ready to kind of start the day, but of course find her dead. And there's a lot of imagery about how death has taken Juliet from them, which we'll of course look at in a little bit more detail. The end of the scene is quite strange because it's a moment that kind of falls into some of the tragic conventions, because we have this incredibly kind of sad scene, and then some musicians come on and have a sort of like spirited argument with Peter, who's the Capulet chap that we've seen in the past with the nurse. So it's a very sort of strange ending to the scene, a very big contrast from the heightened emotions of the first part. Well, let's look at it in a little more detail. So this is how the scene begins, with the nurse coming in, and you can see through the exclamative minors how excited she is. Mistress, what mistress? Juliet. Why lamb, why lady? You slugabed. Look at these terms of endearment. So it's all very kind of loving, very sort of light-hearted, calling her a slugabed, i.e. like because she's lying in bed too long. There's, little rhetorical questions showing her sort of disbelief at what's happening. What, not a word? And in kind of typical nurse styling, we have this little bit of sexual innuendo. She says, go on, sleep for a week. For the next night, I warrant the county Paris has set up his rest that you shall rest but little. She's saying, oh, you may as well get your rest now because you're not going to be resting when you're in bed with Paris. So very, very kind of typical nurse bawdy humour, and that sort of excitement again, which of course creates such massive juxtaposition with the rest of the scene. Now, this is Lady Capulet arriving and responding to the death of her daughter, or the supposed death of her daughter. She cries, oh me, my child, my only life. So this metaphor is highly emotive, suggesting that Juliet is the one thing that she has that's worth living for. And then she uses imperatives: revive, look up, like she's willing Juliet to wake up, or I will die with thee. Help, help, call help. Now, considering the relationship between Lady Capulet and Juliet, some people find this quite surprising. And it doesn't stop there. Later on, there is even more anguish. Accursed, unhappy, wretched, hateful day. Look at that listing of adjectives, okay? That asyndetic listing. So it's just adjective after adjective with no connectives, all suggesting extreme suffering. Most miserable hour that time ever saw in lasting labour of his pilgrimage. So she personifies here the idea of time. It's a miserable hour, note the superlative there as well. And it's a suggestion that it's just moving on in a journey. So it's all talking about how time has sort of slowed in this moment of great grief. But one poor and loving child. Look at that repetition of the number one, reminding us that Juliet is the only child they have left. They obviously had other children, but they didn't survive. And then that one number is then emphasized through the anaphora, but one thing to rejoice and solace in. Again, another suggestion that Juliet is the one thing in her life that creates happiness, and cruel death hath catched it from my sight. So we've got to ask the question of how genuine this is. It feels really genuine, doesn't it? But when you put it in contrast to what she said earlier on, only an act before, where she said, I would the fool were married to her grave. What sort of ominous foreshadowing of this moment. And now she must probably bitterly regret those words. But we'll come back to her in a moment when we've just had a little look at Lord Capulet. Lord Capulet also has a very big response. He says, death lies on her like an untimely frost upon the sweetest flower of all the field. So again, we've got this simile that once more references time. Death is lying on her like an untimely frost, i.e. it's unexpected. It has come too soon. And we have this metaphor about her being a flower, the sweetest, so another superlative, so the most sweet, the best. There's nothing better or sweeter than Juliet. Sweetest flower of all the fields. So you get this real sense of what he has lost. Again, in his next statement, slightly later on, we still see that anguish. There she lies, flower as she was, deflowered by him. So death is being personified here, but note the way that death is being personified as her lover, that she's lost her virginity to death himself. And then he extends this personification all the way through. Death is my son-in-law, death is my heir, my daughter he hath wedded. I will die and leave him all, as in he is now his sole heir because he has married Juliet. Life, living, all is death. So this idea, it's not just that death has taken her from him too soon, but it's like a contract. She is now wedded to death. Death is the lover that has come and taken her away instead of Paris. And again, this feels very, very emotional, very true, very raw. Only the previous act, hang thee, young baggage, disobedient wretch, those words that called for her to die for disobeying him. And now, in his eyes, that is exactly what has happened. Paris, similar ideas. We've still got the same personification of death, most detestable death by thee beguiled. He's suggesting that excuse me, that death has tricked Juliet in some way, tricked her into marrying. So this is almost like, again, death is a suitor pitted against him, and he's saying, oh, well, he's won her through trickery. Through trickery. Now, this is a different response. So this is the nurse. So we saw the nurse's happy response at the beginning. This is again later on in the scene. And I just want you to have a little look at both the repetition and the minor exclamatives that run all the way through. Oh, woe, woeful, woeful, woeful day. Oh, day, oh, day, oh, day. Oh, hateful day. Oh, woeful day, oh, woeful day. Unlike the other characters, she's not constructing big, complex imagery. There's no kind of big metaphor here. This is just a guttural, horrible response to what she sees. And so that's why her language, I think, is so disjointed. So you've got these very big responses from the family and Capulet, but very, very eloquent, very, very metaphorical in nature. And then you've got the nurse who just reacts, just big emotion. So after all of these very, very big reactions, the friar actually comes in and tells them off. He reprimands them for the kind of size of their emotional responses, which seems quite harsh, especially when you consider the fact that the friar knows that it's not true, and so he also knows that this grief that they're going through is misplaced, and he is a part of this grief and the reason that they're going through it. But let's just have a really brief look at what he's saying. So he's making the point here when he says, heaven and yourself had part in this fair maid, now heaven hath all, and all the better is it for the maid. He's basically saying, look, well, you and heaven created Juliet, and now heaven is claiming her back, and she belongs to heaven, and so it's sort of rightful. And so you can think, oh, well, perhaps he's saying that to be reassuring. Okay. If you look down here, he says, the most you sought, so sought means we're looking for, the most you sought was her promotion. For 'twas your heaven she would be advanced, and weep ye now, seeing she is advanced above the clouds as high as heaven itself. So the criticism that he's making there is what their sort of motivations are for their grief and their crying. He's saying the only thing that you wanted from Juliet was for her to advance herself and the family through marriage. So this is quite a cynical outlook, that what you were looking for was her promotion, so marrying her well. And then the Friar is basically making the point that, well, if you wanted her promoted, if you wanted her to advance, what better promotion is there than heaven itself? Because now she is up there. So how can you be unhappy when she has reached the highest point that anyone can? But the suggestion is that one of the reasons that he's annoyed at this very big emotional response is that perhaps, what are they crying for? Is it the fact that she is not going to marry well and bring more on their family, etc.? And then right at the end of just this little section, there's quite a sort of damning comment on marriage, and possibly even Capulet and Lady Capulet themselves, because he uses this as another reason for them to cheer up. She's not well married that lives married long, but she's best married that dies married young, which basically means people that stay in marriages for a long time will eventually not be happily married, whereas someone who dies young and at the beginning of the marriage at least has that kind of sense of happiness. Which of course reminds us of the fact that Capulet and Lady Capulet are clearly not married. So he's almost like saying, better that she dies now when she's young and happy than lives to be like you guys. I mean, it's quite blunt, it's quite harsh, but perhaps it makes us question those reactions of the family. You know, having seen them behave so abominably towards Juliet, and seeing Lady Capulet behave so coldly towards her daughter, you know, not protecting her from the wrath of Capulet. Those huge emotional reactions can seem quite difficult to swallow, which is one of the reasons that some performances actually just take that scene out and they just don't show that reaction, and they focus more on the tragic reactions later on from, say, Romeo. You know, that's to you to decide. If you view it as actually, oh no, they've learned their lesson, they realise that they were wrong and that's why their grief is so massive, that is valid as well. But it's worth just having that question. The end of the scene is pretty interesting. I've given you a term here, keyword bathos. Bathos is like an anti-climax. It's something that sort of undermines the tragedy or the tension of a scene. It can sometimes be humorous. And, you know, this might be about comic relief in this moment, but it certainly is a very strange end to the scene, where the musicians, who are obviously meant to be there for the wedding, are still there, and Peter, who's one of the Capulets, asks them to play a tune and they say no. Peter's like, "I'll play something mournful," and they say no, and then they just sort of get into a little bit of a skirmish actually, and it is a strange moment. But I think, again, everything has been so heightened that what Shakespeare's trying to do is just give everyone a little bit of a break and just bring it down somewhat, because of course we've got to remember that this is a fake death. This isn't even the real tragedy. So he's going to bring us down so that he can bring us back up again. Okay, so just last little thoughts from me. What are the key themes of this scene? Obviously we've got love, but love comes into different it's not the romantic love necessarily that is interesting here, it's the familial love, and how genuine that love is. Is that love only realized when the family realize what they've lost? We've also got the kind of sense of consequences here. The friar's got to be considering the consequences of his actions in all of this, but perhaps there's an element of consequence to Lady and Lord Capulet's behaviour and how it makes them feel now that they've lost their daughter. Death is a biggie, huge one, massive personification of death. Look out for that later on from Romeo as well, this idea of death taking, death wedding, death consuming. And obviously family, the big family reactions all fits into the kind of concept of love here as well. Right, that's it from me. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that was helpful. Any questions or comments, just pop them in the comments under the video and I will get back to you. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. And then you will get alerts and notifications when the next set of videos are available for you. Do have a look at the playlists, because you will find lots of things that will help you with your study of English literature and English language. Right, that's it from me. Thank you so much again. Happy revising.